Hello, everybody. My name is Griselda Pollock, and I'm here with Gill Park in sunny Leeds. And we're doing this in preparation for your wonderful conference, which we will be virtually present at. I have the pleasure of introducing Gill Park to you, who is the world's expert on Pavilion and the Pavilion, women's photography centre that was founded in Leeds, which we're going to be the focus of our conversation. I was one of the early directors of that and have the sort of living archive of a certain moment of the history that Gill more penetratingly researched in the course of her PhD, which was based on understanding the Pavilion and its context as an art centre in Leeds, in Yorkshire, dedicated to photography and led and directed by women. So we've set up a number of conversations backwards and forwards between the sort of generations, between my knowledge from the actual 80s and Gill's knowledge as a contemporary feminist researcher. So my first question to Gill is this. Hello, Gill. I want you to tell me about how you got interested in researching Pavilion, and maybe you could explain a little bit about what it was for those who might not know.
Yeah, thank you, Griselda. So the Pavilion, just to kind of say, basically, the Pavilion started out as a women's photography centre, which opened its doors in May 1983 in a renovated refreshment pavilion on Woodhouse Moor, which is a public park located between the University of Leeds campus and the inner city suburb of Hyde Park in northwest Leeds. It was established by three women who were recent graduates of the Department of Fine Art at the university: Dinah Clark, Caroline Taylor and Shirley Moreno, who are represented here on this opening leaflet. Here is the Pavilion in its original building. It's now, that building is now occupied by an Indian restaurant. I wasn't even born when Pavilion opened, but I did work at Pavilion from 2008 to 2017, by which point it was no longer framed as a women's photography centre or in any way a feminist project, but rather it placed its emphasis on commissioning photographic and film work. So conceptually and critically interesting work, but without this kind of sense of political driving force that had been there at the outset. It was only in 2013 when we kind of recognised that it was the organisation's 30th anniversary and it might be strategic to do something around that we began to think about how to celebrate Pavilion's anniversary. And we started to become conscious as a team, none of whom had been there in the beginning, of Pavilion's history. And its focus, this sort of interesting seeming focus, but sort of mystifying focus to us on the relationship between feminist politics and a certain kind of photographic artwork during the 1980s. Here's a photograph from the dark room at the Pavilion, which is one of its facilities. So as a way of marking our 30 years as a cultural organisation in Leeds, we decided to explore the archives. As part of this, we commissioned a new artwork by the artist Luke Fowler, and as part of that conducted archival research, as well as a number of oral history interviews, with women who were there at the outset of the project. So it's worth saying that there's a exhibition still. Here's a slightly fuzzy image from the Feminist Archive North, which is where this is part of special collections housed at the University of Leeds. And this is where the Pavilion's first 10 years have been archived. So I guess what we sort of started to read when we read through this sort of uncatalogued collection of very incomplete minutes of meetings and reports and letters, started to sort of get a sense of both the sort of real investment and labour that went into setting up this project, as well as the struggle to gain support for what it became. And then through the interviews that we conducted, we also really gained a sense of how important this project was for the women involved, even 30 years on. And these are women who've gone on to do really impressive things in the arts, cultural sector, as well as social care and elsewhere. But I just really felt this sense of the pavilion being this very serious and important project at its moment of formation, but one that was not really kind of fully captured by the archive or by a sort of collective contemporary knowledge of what the pavilion was. It seemed like the archive definitely seemed incomplete, and the project sort of not fully understood. So I really wanted to understand what was so significant about it as a project, and why did it mean so much to the women involved? What did it mean for this women's photography centre, which was marketed as the kind of first of its kind in Britain to open up? What did it mean for that to open in Leeds? What did it mean for it to open in 1983? Why photography, and why feminism? Why this sort of intersection at that moment? So Griselda, at this time, you were teaching in the Department of Fine Art at the University of Leeds. You taught the 3 women who went on to set the pavilion up. As you said, you were part of the management committee and did a lot to support the organisation in establishing itself and running in the opening years. And I wondered if you can give us a sense of the context of its formation, like what it took to set up the project and negotiate with the funders, the Arts Council in particular.
Well, thank you, Jill. That's a wonderful introduction to it, because it was an extraordinary project, but very much in a moment of both feminism and feminist activism, and also development of regional activities, where it was a kind of activism. This is what you would go out and do. So it was very intriguing that these 3 women, Caroline, Shirley, and Dinah, had taken on the issue of photography, but photography wasn't in the sense of, camera today or photography today. It was to do with representation, because that's the first context. Women and photography is about women and who makes images and what images are made and what happens if we don't have control of the means of production. Photography being very much a kind of, as Joe Spence had shown, the fathers had the cameras, the women and the families were the objects, and there was a kind of division of labor. But the context of feminist investigations of the image, which is what I'd been introducing through lectures, showing them Laura Mulvey's films and Song of the Shirt, and a whole range of different kinds of new forms of intervention by women in 16mm, 8mm and film, etc. But at the same time, John Tagg came to teach in Leeds, who was part of a group who began to make photographic history not a matter of the great men of photography, but in the sense of history inspired in part by kind of Foucault's ideas about a technology for surveillance, who gets represented, who doesn't get represented. He wrote a book called The Burden of Representation, in the sense so that the documentary photography is always, the burden falls on those who do not have the rights to represent themselves back, but are represented by middle-class investigators or governments and so forth. So I think this question of representation, feminism had opened this up. 1984, there was going to be an exhibition called Difference in Representation. So there was a different sort of language that we were in part looking at advertising, we were looking at film. And then there was this sense that you had to bring together something where not only did you analyze photography, but you also learned to make photography. And the third part of it was what had emerged in this area called third area work, where under the impact of conceptual art, as well as of reclaiming and rewriting social documentary as a more complex, power entangled system of imaging and being imaged. Once those come together, it was possible for us to be thinking about photography at the pavilion as this investigative tool, this tool with which the world could be investigated. So whether it was issues of class or the family or health, it was not images of women or images of a certain of landscape or nudes or the sort of typical things that were being taught in photography. It was a means by which what Mary Kelly called, that we were undertaking inquiries into the nature of racism, of patriarchy. So women in photography is one of them. The other thing is this question of the lack of these facilities for people in the regions being composed then very much in a sense of people from many parts of the world, the traditional migrants like the Vikings and others who come to Yorkshire, etc., but also very interesting Asian communities and African Caribbean communities, none of whom's women had access, in a sense, to the means of their self-representation in changing the sense of what Britain was. So that was a very crucial element of it. And the third thing that you asked me, which was, I think, really crucial, which is how does something that is being mobilized with such intense commitment to groundedness in the community, in Leeds, putting it in the middle of the park in Woodhouse, making it accessible, teaching women to do photographs, as well as showing them what women were doing with the photographic image as this inquiry. How did that bump up against the Arts Council, who had the notion that there's community arts and there's professional arts and there's painting and sculpture, and then there's this strange new set of art forms that are emerging on the edges of the art schools, which uses the photographic medium but isn't photography. It's investigative, conceptual kind of art making. And so these clashed. So they were prepared to say, okay, yes, the local people needed, art in a certain kind of way, but then that was community funding. And if you were going to train women of Asian families to make photography, that's community service. But you can't then expect us to give you the money to be able to mount serious shows that will now, be like a London show. So you can see here this from your lovely memo you found, this the visit from the local person, Simon Hoothouse, with John Tagg, who was, as I say, this also chairman of the photography committee. And the memos by Barry Lane, a rather dispiriting visit. They had withdrawn program support because of issues, ineffective management, lack of local authority, and growing exclusiveness of events, i.e. it's too focused on women, but also this sense that they couldn't grasp and accommodate into their portfolio system at the time something that was highly theoretical, highly activist, highly sort of grounded. So let's go back to what you found when you began to look at all of this stuff by looking at the archives. Tell me what it took to research Pavilion and maybe what your main findings were. What would you want to say to the world from having re-looked at this?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So as I said, that there is an archive of the Pavilion, papers, posters, minutes from board meetings, and some additional documentation in some of the institutional archives like the Yorkshire Arts Association, which give this sense of a kind of sustained project, but also in a way a kind of failed project. So there's this kind of focus on the struggle, particularly the struggle for funding, and to make this argument that you're talking about, Griselda, around this kind of new sense of work, photographic work. Which definitely resonated with me as someone who was working for an arts organisation, for the Contemporary Pavilion, and trying myself to make an argument for something that was small in scale, that wasn't reaching out to kind of vast numbers of audiences or mounting large-scale exhibitions, but was trying to kind of enable a critical conversation around certain kinds of work. So I guess one thing to say is that there was always this sort of, in a way, comforting identification with this is part of this kind of, this isn't just us failing to do our jobs well, but this is kind of part of what it means to try and put something in the world that kind of disrupts the dominant values of art. But I guess, as I said before, when I was approaching the archive, I was trying to sort of catch what it was that was so important about what Pavilion set out to do that wasn't, as you say, legible to the funders. And we had this set of oral history interviews, the sort of living archive, as it were, one of whom was with you, Griselda, which had been recorded in 2013, and which presented a set of kind of different disparate testimonies of women who experienced the pavilion during the 1980s. So as a way of kind of thickening and enlivening the accounts that were made visible through the more formal archive, I decided to read these interviews through a method that we had lots of discussion about Griselda in PhD supervisions, called the grounded theory method, usually used in the social sciences, but which is important and interesting because it kind of grounds concepts in the analysis of the words of the subjects of experience, memory, and history, rather than kind of imposing a hypothesis or theoretical frame upon these words. So I won't go into the kind of detail of the coding process, but to say that this provided me with a sort of route to kind of read across these different experiences. Some people who'd experienced the more, like you say, the more kind of community side of what Pavilion was doing, some of whom were artists, others who were administrators in the project, but to kind of read across and see this kind of shared kind of investment in what I went on to call the feministing photography. So not feminist in terms of a kind of descriptor, a sort of style of photography, but as a kind of more active word, which was kind of mobilizing photography for particular political and activist purposes. And then I went on to read 3 exhibitions which I felt were of particular significance in terms of giving a sense of what this kind of feministing photography could mean. And I do think, you know, like on the face, the archive, you know, Pavilion could look somewhat kind of amateur when you're reading it back. Like it was very small. It was in this kind of crumbling building. A lot of the exhibitions were deliberately made by people who weren't artists, who were not professionally trained, as part of, as you say, giving women access to their self-representation. It was volunteer-led, it's always struggling for funding, but at the same time, if we look through this lens of feministing photography, we can see these really remarkable exhibitions that were being shown at the Pavilion, which were recognising particular interventions and innovations in photography, which were only much later recognised by the sort of major institutions of contemporary art. So we can see evidence of this kind of radical work that was going on that is now sort of being seen and recognised as a very important part of our art history in Britain. So what I tried to do was work with the archive and with the oral histories to reconstruct these exhibitions and figure out what they looked like and what they were and how they were formed. And part of that was engaging with some of the difficult theoretical resources that were being read and debated at the time in the 1980s, Althusser, Lacan, and to sort of understand what this relationship between politics and aesthetics was that we can identify in this kind of particular type of photographic work. So just to show a couple of images, this is a poster from the testimony exhibit. It's actually a poster from when it was shown at Camera Work in Bethnal Green, was also shown at the Pavilion. And this was a show that was brought together, included Brenda Agard, Ingrid Pollard, Maud Salter, and was brought together by Shutta Biswas, who's presenting at the conference, and who was a student at Leeds and was the darkroom and outreach coordinator at Pavilion. So we have this really nice example of a kind of bridge between, you know, who was really engaged intellectually with everything that was going on at Leeds, making amazing work, and was very invested in reaching out, as you said, to the local community of Woodhouse Moor, where Pavilion was located, and brought this amazing exhibition of work by 3 Black women photographers who were thinking about the significance of photography, both in terms of making visible the violence of representation in relation to Black women's experiences, and as being the site of creative political work that was decolonising the photographic image to kind of change the visual record. So this was one example of feministing photography. This is Mari Yates and Eve Lomax's work in a show called The Image in Trouble, who were undertaking this kind of questioning of the concept of woman through the language of conceptual art, and were analysing kind of how subjectivity has been constituted in and through the image. Highly kind of complex, conceptual, very interesting work there. And then Jo Spence as another example of, this is the picture of health, but Jo Spence has obviously kind of examined the way in which the kind of relationship between the camera and the photograph to processes of capitalism and the lived experiences of women, and how kind of using her own embodied experience of the world to show how capitalism inscribes itself onto the classed and gendered body. So we have these kind of different instances of work, which what seems so interesting is that it was, as you said, Griselda, showing this organisation that was able to hold together a kind of politicised activism and engagement with lived experiences of women with theoretical feminist engagements, and negotiating this kind of relationship between theory and practice through the intersection of art education, feminism and exhibition practice. You know, it was on the one hand teaching women to make photographs when they didn't have another way. They didn't have, I spoke to someone who attended a workshop who knew there was a darkroom at her school, but no one ever showed it to her or how to use it. So this was giving women cameras and darkroom facilities and skills to determine their own representations. But then it was also exhibiting work by leading women artists, and kind of engaging in debates around the image. And these things together seem to be such an interesting model for an arts organisation, but one that I don't think still the kind of funders can kind of really sort of accept. So this sort of seeing Pavilion as this kind of potential that was doing certain things, but also showing the way in which an arts organisation can kind of operate in a very sort of meaningful way that's not exclusive to audiences, but is also not, is also kind of embracing radical experimental practice, is what I think has been so inspiring for me. So, so Griselda, just to ask you a question, yeah, can you give us a sense of the political, cultural context for Pavilion as you experienced it in terms of feminism and art in Britain at that moment?
Well, I think, Gill, you've explained it brilliantly in that last sense of holding those three elements of something that is like Rochdale, like Jill Morgan's concept of Rochdale, which is here is a community that deserves to have the best of art, the best of resources, and the best of discussion, as it were, of stimulation. This doesn't mean bringing, you know, high art from New York to Rochdale only. It does actually making sure that Rochdale people have access to that, but in a context where it makes sense. And I think that's what was so interesting, what you've just put together, which Rosie Parker and I framed it as this tension between practical strategies, how to empower, you know, provide the resources, provide the support and, you know, safe environments for women to learn to make images and to understand the role of the image in the world technically, but also theoretically, but also what are called strategic practices, ones where you really are intervening in the entire system of knowledge and power and the image, which was such a central part of the feminist critique. You know, feminism of the post-68 is an engagement in the politics of knowledge and the politics of the image and the politics of the subject, but also the politics of institutions. And so I think that was the crucial thing. So the 1980s inherited both the activism that said, we're just going to go out and do it like the women's liberation movement. We'll set up our own organizations, we'll teach ourselves, we'll have workshops, we'll have study groups. We are going to we are the force because the institutions haven't provided up with this. But on the other hand, this idea of strategic practices, when you knowingly engage with some of the most challenging political and theoretical issues. And that is, I think, significant and unique to Pavilion and what happened in Leeds because of the relationship with the Fine Art Department, with Leeds Metropolitan University, it was Leeds Poly then. You know, there was a lot of artists, so a lot of interesting thinking going on in this. And, you know, Terry Atkinson brought us with all issues to do with conceptual art and stuff. But also we were very much aware of the kind of work that was happening at the ICA and other institutions like the Difference and Representation Show. You know, that was where we were seeing the Nancy Spiros, the Cindy Shermans and these work, but they were all happening in London. And what was interesting, the Pavilion said, this has to be linked between a real sense of the community here and the artists and the women who are in this and London. So this notion of marrying practical strategies to strategic practices is something that institutions and governments can't do, because they are constantly imagining the public, you know, the audience, you know, and the art and the curatorial as already set at a non-local level. You know, well, they're local to London. That's what they think is what it is. And they have no understanding that when you go outside of it, you haven't gone into community versus, you know, Hayward Gallery type exhibitions, bringing those together and creating the framework. So putting photography into the hands of women makes it much easier when you say, look at images, go and look at magazines, then look at Mara Yates. You'll begin to see this is an interconnected work and you're living in it, or you are absent from it. Why are there no Black women in these images? Why are there no Asian women? How do we confront our own communities about visibility and women? So I think the context of the 80s, you know, involved in the Pavilion a way to bridge between a very high level of theorization that was shattering everybody as they were struggling with it in the university level, and a very deep commitment to the lived experiences of diverse communities of women that constituted the 1980s Britain. And this is an era of intense racism, of violence, of anti-immigration in many levels, the emergence of the Black women, Black artist movement, and at the same time, this very specific kind of conversation between feminism and conceptual art feminism and cinema and photography. And Pavilion uniquely brought those together. And you showed that letter that I wrote, if you could go back maybe to that one, which I wrote in protest against the saying it was rather a dismal visit. They simply couldn't get it, but possibly we didn't yet know or have the terms ourselves to understand how remarkable this moment was. And this is why I think this conference is so important in realizing how many remarkable groups and collectives of women, such as at Rochdale around Jill Morgan or such as around the Pavilion, sprang up at this moment and provide a model now as we despair of everything becoming so financialized, so centralized, and apparently this loss of the intellectual, theoretical, and practical entanglement that was unique at that particular point. So gender, sexuality, minority, diversity, these were the things that we found being shown at the Icon or at the Arnolfini or studied at the Watershed Photography Centre in Bristol. They were all away from the centres, but very much in connection with them and ensuring that this was dispersed. I have a fear that we may have gone over time at this point. So I think we've sort of explained the significance that we have, that this particular case study, but I think you have very much brought alive with your research the incredible significance of Pavilion, but your concept of feministing, this idea of how do you do this transformation? How is it that we diversify, we feminist, you know, we inclusivist you know, these are active verbs that need strategies. And the study that you did of the pavilion, I think, is a model for that, which I think we should all congratulate you and look forward to its publication soon. But thank you very much for sharing it. And thank you again for bringing me back in contact with something that was such a lovely part of my experience.
Thank you, Griselda.
So do you want to say anything final, and we will hand over for conversation?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's great. Yeah, and I think it's maybe just one more thing to say, that there's definitely this sense of the sort of network of the organisations that you mentioned, Griselda, and there was this nice link between Pavilion and Rochdale actually through the work of Quinn, a photographic artist who made a body of work called Chucky Allah, Our Day Will Come, and we know that toured to Rochdale and actually had a kind of very interesting reception, which is perhaps a story for the conversation. But yeah, this kind of idea of the sort of network as a counter to the kind of competitive funding climate, which is constantly being produced, I think is really sort of interesting to think about and revisit. And this idea that Tom Steele has captured with the idea of the kind of provincial avant-garde, and the fact that we can counter this sort of sender-receiver model of arts organisations, which we see, you know, today with like the British Art Show. The Hayward sends this great show out, and regional galleries have the privilege of paying a lot of money to show it. You know, we have this sense of such interesting work being produced in, you know, the places of Leeds, and not even Leeds, but the suburb of Hyde Park and of Rochdale. And it's really, I think, heartening to look back to this decade when the most exciting things were happening in, like you say, Griselda, outside of the sort of centre of London. So yeah, thanks so much for inviting us to be part of the conference, and we look forward to the conversation that will follow.
Thank you. Thank you. And we will sign off there. So I'm going to just go up to where it is.